Hello. Welcome to the iLog channel. My name is Casey, and thank you for joining me for another calm commentary video. The series where I basically just ramble over top of me doing some kind of task. And if I'm not rambling, I'm just describing what I'm doing in the video. It's all fun over here. Today's video is the process of me upgrading my PC. And much like the previous DS Lite digitizer repair video, this was actually recorded a couple months ago, and I have only now gotten around to recording the voiceover. Ah yes, the inside of the computer. Full of dust and poorly managed cables. By the end of this video, the cable management isn't going to be any better, so don't get your hopes up. Here I'm fumbling to remove the power supply dust cover, and in doing so realized that it hadn't been inserted correctly the last time I had removed it, which meant the power supply was full of dust, as the dust cover had not been seated flat against the power supply intake fan. How fun! The first thing I had to do was remove all the power supply cables going to every device as I was replacing the power supply in this upgrade. I was upgrading from a 430 watt power supply to a 650 watt as the new GPU I got I was worried would overload the power supply. I am also replacing the existing 1050 Ti graphics card with a 1660 Super graphics card, as well as putting a disk drive in the computer capable of reading CDs, DVDs, and Blu-rays, and installing new fans, as this computer has been operating off of a sole exhaust fan in the rear of the computer for its entire existence. The upgrade will now include 2 intake fans and 1 rear exhaust fan. The intakes are going on the front, behind the sort of built-in dust filter that exists in the computer. And after getting everything unplugged and removing the screws from the rear, I could remove the entire power supply. Ooh, look at all that dust on the bottom of the computer. Delicious. And look at that unintentionally wonderful framing. That power supply fit perfectly in the gap left by the computer there. The next thing I did was remove the rear exhaust fan, as I wouldn't be using it as I had gotten 3 new fans for the process. Ooh, and look at that dust. Yep, this computer was definitely not in a great state dust-wise. Though as you'll see soon enough, that will get resolved. And of course, for easier access to where the fans would go, I removed the front cover, which also acts as a dust filter for the computer, and then got to work removing the old graphics card. First unlatching the PCIe slot, and then removing the screws from the bracket mount, or mounting bracket, whichever one you think is better. And out comes the GPU. There we go, not setting it down on the circuit board. Good thinking, Casey. Here's the fun bit. I blew out all the dust. Fair warning if you're listening on headphones, it might get a bit loud. And I blew the old fan off my table. Now I want you to envision this in your head. To get that fan that fell off the table, I had to walk around the table. However, on the side of the table where the walkway is, there is a tripod for the camera. On the other side of the table is a metal rack. So every time I have to get to the other side of the table, I want you to keep the image in your head of me trying to make myself as small as possible and uncomfortably crawling underneath the tripod. Just think about that. It might make you laugh. Ha ha. Ha ha ha. One thing worth noting is that every time I was blowing the dust off of something, if it had a fan on it, I was holding the fan in place. You'll notice that I held down the fan on the CPU cooler. This is to prevent any back voltage from traveling from the fan into the motherboard and potentially damaging something. This is a good idea, and often why people will say that cleaning your computer with compressed air or a electric duster like this is not a good idea because people will often not hold the fan steady, resulting in damaged components when the fans generate back current. The first new component I decided to install was the optical drive. For the entire lifespan of this computer, which was originally built in about 2017, I have never had an optical drive in this system and have wanted one for quite a while. Now, I had a separate laptop that had a disk drive that could handle CDs and DVDs, but this was the first drive I've ever had in my entire life that could handle Blu-rays, even in terms of a separate Blu-ray player. Never had one, though I've never owned Blu-rays until this point, so there was never a need. However, now I can play Blu-rays on my computer, and I'm very happy about that. As well as that, it's just a generally high-speed disc player, so ripping CDs, for instance, is a very quick process. Now, this case has an interesting little plastic lock that is designed to hold in an optical drive or any other 5.5-inch drive bay accessories that you might need. I did end up using this piece in the upgrade. However, I also installed screws into all available screw holes for the drive, just because I didn't really want the drive being held in by just half of the points when I knew something like an optical drive can wiggle around and vibrate when it's active. So I made sure that there were screws in all the available screw points to make sure it was held steady in place, and also used the plastic locking mechanism just because it was there and it was like 2 less screws I had to install, so sure. Now, initially I was always cautious about how much room there was going to be to fit a disk drive, with the power switch and USB header cables running out of the front panel of the system, but there was just enough room, thankfully. It's almost like they designed it to work like that. At this point, I was sort of just roughly fitting on the front cover just so I knew where things could go. This was before I realized that the screw holes would tell me where it needed to go. Here I am reaching for the 7-year-old package of case accessories that I still have. This is why you always keep these kinds of things. Looking for the little package of screws that came with the system so that I could install this disk drive into the screw holes with actual screws along with the little plastic mount after I thought that the plastic locking mount just wasn't strong enough. After spending a long time making sure I knew which way the fans had to go in orientation-wise, I started working on getting them set in the right positions. This process was a little difficult because I had to sort of guess where the second fan would go on top of the first, while only being able to hold in one while getting the screws in, which the screws were quite hard to get in. They sort of operate like wood screws, where you're building the threads into the plastic and sort of drilling in as you screw in, so they're quite hard to turn. However, I did eventually come to the amazing conclusion of just not putting the screws in all the way so that things were still loose enough to readjust. All of the screw holes for the fans had a slotted design. You could raise them up higher or lower depending on how you wanted them, instead of just being a fixed hole size. This meant that getting the vertical position was slightly more difficult than if they were just one single position hole. One of my original concerns when I was working out and planning this upgrade was whether or not adding more fans to the computer would make it much louder. And when these fans do spin up to a much faster speed, they can be a little more noticeable than just the single fan I had before. When they're running passively, and in most situations, I can barely tell they're there. It might even be quieter than the single fan I had before, though I can't prove or disprove that. So take it with a grain of salt when I say that. But it has been nice to have the peace of mind that my computer is now getting far better airflow than it ever was before. After getting both intake fans installed, a process which in the video mostly looks like the back of my head and nothing else, I started working out how I wanted the cable routing to go. My motherboard only has 2 fan headers, one for the CPU fan, so that can't really be doing anything else, and one case fan header. Now, luckily, these Fantex, whatever they're called, fans, something 30 fans, or I don't remember the exact name, have a sort of daisy chaining cable design where each fan has a little cable sticking out that has both a male and a female connector, so you can very easily link fans together. So the two intake fans, for instance, are just daisy chained together with that cable, and then I have a second longer cable, which is included in the pack of fans, running to the daisy chained end of the rear exhaust fan, and then the rear exhaust fan's main cable is connecting to the actual motherboard case fan header. Of course, this is why I didn't keep the original rear exhaust fan. Having multiple fans like this and using fan splitters often means you want the same types of fans on the same fan headers if they're being split. This is so that they're all being driven properly, all accounting for the same requirements of voltage relative to how fast they're spinning. Though I imagine, as most things are with tech, you probably could get away with not doing it perfectly if you wanted to. I've turned the computer on its side in order to install the rear fan. This fan was much easier to install than the two intake fans because installing one fan was, of course, easier than two. Only having to install one meant that I wasn't trying to position the vertical heights of two different fans around each other and could just position it wherever it ended up being positioned. After screwing the fan in, I started getting to work on where exactly I wanted the cables to be routed. This was a bit tricky as some of the cables had to be twisted around a bit awkwardly in order to fit properly on the motherboard fan header, but it all worked out in the end. So the rear exhaust's main cable was plugged directly into the header, and then I took the main cable of the top intake fan and connected that to a cable extension, and connected that extension cable to the daisy chain port on the rear exhaust fan. Of course, more of my amazing cable management. The next thing I did was get the power supply cables from this new power supply. It's a Corsair something or other 630 watt semi-modular power supply, meaning the CPU and motherboard connectors are built into the power supply, but everything else is a modular cable that can be removed if you don't need it. And at this stage, after unbundling all the cables, I was starting to put my plan together of where I wanted these various cables to go, and which ones I would need or not need for this project. And then slowly but surely began the process of inserting all the cables into the devices I need them to go to before plugging them into the power supply, and before even putting the power supply into the case. I wasn't quite sure if this was the right call in the moment, but in retrospect, I think it was the right decision to make. Inserting all the power cables into devices made it a little bit easier to manage the cables, though my cable management is still quite poor. A big issue during this process was trying to figure out how I'd get the SATA power cables to my boot drive. At this point, my boot SSD was positioned on the back of the computer. It had never been an issue to get a power cable to it before, but these cables were designed in such a way that the amount of metal on the case to where the SSD was meant it was just a little more difficult to actually get the cable into the power socket of this SSD. And after trying and removing my sweatshirt because it was getting a little bit warm, I just decided to reposition the SSD somewhere else inside the case. I was originally going to try to position the SSD on the other side of the case from where it was mounted originally, but it still proved to not have proper clearances, so instead I removed the hard drive bay from my system, which had the ability to have an SSD mounted on the top of it. This resulted in a very interesting procedure where I was trying to constantly maneuver around the hard drives to screw this in. Because instead of just removing the SATA cables from the hard drives, I chose to leave them attached and simply snake the shroud around the cables. This made the process much more difficult than it probably needed to be, but it meant I didn't have to worry about remembering which hard drive was which. Upon screwing the SSD in, I was happy to learn that there was enough clearance for the SATA power cable, which made life just so much easier, and then I was able to get the hard drives back in, and then try to get the hard drive bay back in the case, which was somewhat difficult due to it having to be held down with two separate screws. One of those screws is on the bottom and was a little bit difficult to get to around the hard drive, but it was a thumb screw, so it was a little easier to screw in. At least I didn't have to navigate a screwdriver inside the hard drive bay. And you can see there the SSD positioned on top of the bay. At this point, I got back to work, positioning out where the power cables needed to be. This power supply came with 2 different SATA power cables, one of which featured 2 daisy chain SATA power connections, and the other cable featured, I think, 3 or 4 daisy chain SATA power connections. I used the 3 or 4 connector daisy chained power cable to connect the 2 hard drives and the SSD together, and then use the other 2 connector long cable to connect SATA power to the disk drive. This did prove a little difficult for the hard drives and the SSD, as they were all so close together that the cable had to be very carefully bent correctly so that it would all fit. All, of course, without putting too much tension on the cables. And here I am just doing a quick test fit of the side panel to make sure it'll still fit with the cables kind of bulging out the way they were. Luckily, I was able to get everything to fit, so I removed the panel again and got back to work, not realizing the fatal mistake I had made, that the other side panel had still been removed. This would later become a problem. At this point, I was ready to install the actual power supply. And I even decided to try and be cool and manage the CPU and motherboard power cables through the back of the system like a cable management type thing. This would later come back to bite me in the ass. You'll find out more about that soon enough. I then spent an astoundingly long amount of time screwing the new power supply in, because of course it's been 7 years since I installed the power supply, and I forgot how tough the screws would be to get in. At one point, I tested the screws on the old power supply and found they were just as difficult, and realized that's just how they feel to go in. I was initially worried they were cross-threading, but I don't think that was the case. They're just difficult to get in. We then get to see the moment where, much like Icarus, my wax wings began to melt from flying too close to the sun. My attempt at coolly managing the power cables behind the case proved to be more difficult than I thought, as trying to get them set up in a way where the rear panel could actually be mounted to the computer while the cables were still in there proved to be incredibly difficult, as it essentially boiled down to trying to smush the cables in. After a little bit of finagling, I was able to slide one of the power cables just the right way under a part of the case so that I could get the rear panel on, but getting the panel on was still difficult. And since doing this upgrade, I have had an instance where I had to remove that panel and put it back on, and yeah, it's still just about as difficult. And finally, after spending far too long on it and awkwardly contorting myself for far too long, I got the rear panel on. Was it worth it? No. Will it cause long-term damage to the cables? I have no idea. Ask me in about 10 years. Next came one of the bits I was most excited for, the switch from the GeForce GTX 1050 Ti to the GeForce GTX 1660 Super. One of my main reasons for my interest in upgrading to this GPU over something in the RTX series is that the GTX 1660 Super is a pretty good gaming graphics card for like 1080p 60 FPS gaming, which is really where my interests lie. That, and I'm not interested in ray tracing, as in its current state, it still isn't up to snuff to being really a useful lighting thing in a game, and mostly just feeling like a gimmick tacked on for the sake of gimmicks. It also has more upgraded GPU cores, NVIDIA's, I want to say, Tensor technology or Tensor technology, I don't know exactly what it's called, which allowed me to use a mod in Minecraft called NVIDIUM, which takes advantage of these cores for incredibly far render distance loading while keeping the gameplay buttery smooth. It is fantastic. And then, of course, I said screw it all after getting use of this graphics card in Windows for like a week or two, and then being like, okay, no longer dual booting Windows and Linux, I'm fully converting the computer to Linux, which means pretty much almost every game I'm running now is running through Proton and Steam, so I'm not even really getting the full benefits of this card anyway. Poor planning on my part, maybe, but it's worth it alone for that Minecraft mod. Is there anything better than removing a GPU from that anti-static plastic? I'm not sure there is. And now the wonderful moment of truth, actually putting the GPU in. course, I had to move my absolute bird's nest of cables out of the way to ensure that it could actually get it in. But once I got past the cables, it was pretty easy. Just slide it into the PCIe slot, make sure it clicks in, and then put in the screws to the bracket. And luckily it fit. One of my concerns as I was looking for a GPU to upgrade from the 1050 Ti was whether or not it would fit in the case. GPUs from the past few years have had this tendency to just keep getting longer and longer and longer. And so my decision to go with a 1660 Super was also based around the fact that I could get one that was pretty short, this being the EVGA either SC or UC model, I think SC, pretty sure, which was a good size and not much longer than the 1050 Ti, so I could guarantee it would still fit. Looking back on it, maybe I could have gotten away with a slightly longer GPU, but I'm pretty happy with the 1660 Super. And of course, I was able to insert the final power cable. My first time having a GPU that needed a power cable. Actually, the 1050 Ti ran off the power from the PCIe slot alone. So this is my first time with a GPU that needed its own power cable. And part of the reason why I upgraded the power supply too. When I totaled up the existing parts of my computer and the parts I wanted to upgrade to and swapped everything over, removing the old parts that I was replacing in the PC part picker builder thing, the wattage estimation was just under the maximum of the 430 watt power supply, and I know running power supplies that close to their maximum wattage isn't really good for them, so I decided to go with the 650 watt. Then came the fun of trying to put on the front panel, which was a little bit difficult. The inclusion of the rear panel meant that some things got pushed a little forward, especially in the hard drive bay, but eventually I was able to make it fit. Meaning, in some ways, this computer is kind of under probably constant tension inside as it tries to push out against the side panels. Like I said before, I'll let you know in a few years if anything actually breaks from this. Though, so far so good. Even if damage like that does tend to be more long-term than short-term.
Now we see if it turns on.
The computer did in fact work. It works right now. I'm using it as we speak to record this voiceover, and I have since fully converted it from Windows 10 to Linux Mint. That'll be the topic of another video in a few weeks where I'm going to discuss why exactly I switched from Windows to Linux. But of course you'll have to wait for that, and in the future, I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Anyway, if you liked this video, please consider leaving a like. It really helps out the channel. And if you want to see more content, potentially like this, and potentially like other things, as I try to keep a good variety here, you can click that subscribe button and check the notification bell so you'll get notified every time I upload a new video. With all that being said, I'm Casey from the iLog channel, and this is me, signing out. Bye now.